that the last time we spoke, which was a couple weeks ago, the architecture of what's happening in this in with America and Iran is it's different. We can get into that kind of towards the end, but you had mentioned that your parents had come here during the revolution in Iran to America. So I want to really kind of hone in on the journey that your parents took to America and realized your history and their history. So take me back to those beginnings.
Well, my parents came to the US before the revolution, as students. My father had gotten his bachelor's in law from Tehran University, but his last semester in law school in Tehran University, he was arrested by the Savak. And for going to the mountains with like a bunch of other students, like hiking, that
Yeah.
was and at that time they thought anyone who does that is probably like has political affiliation or they're activists or whatnot. And so that was cracked down on. And so they really didn't have any charges against him. They just figured like, first of all, I guess they had two red flags. One was that he went hiking. And the other thing was that he was offered a job, a position to work as a judge in Tehran, but he would have to align himself with whatever the system wanted, and he wasn't willing to do that. And he said that he did not. He said, "I don't want to take this position," and so that was like the second red flag for them. And so he was in prison for a few months without anyone knowing because my dad's family, they all lived in southern Iran. And at that time, I mean, people didn't have phones or anything. So everyone was just like, there's this radio silence for a few months. They weren't really sure why. They figured maybe he's busy with his studies or something like that. And then after a few months, he came home and they realized from the fact that he had, lost weight and his head was shaved and everything, they figured out, something is off. And he told them, yeah, I was in prison um, as a political prisoner, but without any charges. And so when that happened, my grandfather was like, you have to leave the country immediately because this isn't going to stop there.
Yeah.
And my dad had gotten actually full scholarships at American U. So he came to DC and he continued his studies in American U, where he got his doctorates in um, uh, sociology. So that was his story. My mom came to the US at the age of 15, and she, went to high school and everything in the US. And but when I guess her junior year or sophomore year in high school, the revolution took place, and so she became activist in the midst of the revolution, as many in her generation did. And you know, from what I've heard from them, they would go to like all the different events and everything, try to hear what everyone had to say or like what they were promoting or what they were standing for. What was clear to them was they wanted to end to the current, dictatorship, the monarchy that existed in Iran and the Shah. But they were like testing, the waters of what's going on and what's that new democracy going to look like, or this republic. Unfortunately, the revolution was hijacked by Khomeini, and soon after that, there was the hostage crisis and everything. So they never actually returned to Iran. I think if if I'm not mistaken, I think the last time they were in Iran is like 1979. But afterwards, they weren't able to go back to Iran anymore. But they began their activism and becoming more and more, I guess, intertwined with this issue,
Yeah.
especially because of my father's work. I mean, as a writer and a human rights activist, he started concentrating more about the situation in Iran. Especially, I think the turning point for them was 1981, that the mass executions began. Because actually, the first 2 years or so, 2.5 years from 1979 revolution, which is in February till June 20th, 1981. there's this one era in Iran that there were some political freedoms in Iran. I mean, it was right, after the revolution in that atmosphere, Khomeini wasn't able to, from day one, be like, oh, this is what I'm standing for. He had to, play along because those who had created the revolution were like the younger generation. They were progressive. They wanted to see change and they had a lot of, inspiration, aspirations that they were seeking. And so it was step by step, he was taking away those freedoms. One of the, methods that he was able to take away those freedoms was creating these diversions, like the hostage crisis or the Iran-Iraq War, which started in 1980. Both of them started in 1980. So with those, he was able to create this diversion, saying like, look, if you speak against me right now, you are aiding the enemy because there were enemies, right? And so that is what Khomeini did. And actually, he started the Cultural Revolution, which for 3 years, all universities in Iran were shut down because he knew that universities were the hotbed of where all of these, young revolutionaries were. And that's where the revolution had actually started from. And so he wanted to make sure that he could hit that dry. And so what he did was they had the Cultural Revolution, shut down the universities for 3 years. So there wouldn't be a, a possibility to gather and to speak and to be able to, address these issues. And because, it was the age, I guess, of enlightenment and, after the revolution, like this generation was so thirsty to learn more and to also find their place. And they also felt like they were, the agents of change. And so they wanted to use that agency to be able to build that Iran that they were yearning to see. But unfortunately, that was all taken away from them by Khomeini. So that was like the background there. On June 20th, 1981, there was a peaceful protest of 500,000 people in Tehran, and Khomeini ordered on the radio to open fire on the protesters, who were all peaceful, unarmed. Most of them were, teenagers or like in maximum early 20s. And they opened fire on the protesters. And from that night, the mass executions began in Iran. I know people who they were themselves teenagers at the time, like 15, 16 years old. They were in prison at that time as political prisoners for, selling newspapers or handing out pamphlets. And they remember counting the coup de grâces that night, like 300, 200 each night in just every prison. And from the next day, you saw these the newspapers of the regime would print out names every day of people who had been executed the night before. And then there will be also these pictures. We actually have the copy of some of those newspapers. They still exist, but it's like pictures of, I guess, like 10, 12 people. And it says, would the parents of these children come and identify their bodies? Because we don't even know their names. They're all teenage girls who have been severely tortured before being executed without them even knowing their names. They were taken to the gallows and executed. So the regime was trying to spread fear in society that way. They wanted to send a message that, look, I see no mercy when it comes to holding my grip on power. Um, they had 13-year-old girls executed, elderly mothers in their 70s executed, pregnant women executed, um, you know, sports champions, some of, prominent personalities from professors to doctors to entire families who were killed. Like, for instance, I don't know, how much a 13-year-old knows about politics to be executed based on that. But like, for instance, there are also complete families who were wiped out. Like, for instance, the Shafai family, Dr. Shafai, who was one of the most prominent doctors in Isfahan, him, his wife, two of their sons, and two of their daughters, and their son-in-law were all executed. The only two people remaining from this family, one was the 7-year-old child who was at school when they raided their house, and the other was their 16-year-old daughter at that time who had been arrested previously in a different province of Iran. And so she was in prison and they didn't make the connection to have her executed too. So these are like the sole survivors of that family. And unfortunately, we know families that have had like 13, 14 members of their, family executed. Or like, for instance, I know a mother, she lives here in Paris right now. She actually lost four of her children, of five children. The first one, he was killed the day before his wedding. Then 40 days later, the second son was executed, who was 16, I believe. And then 3 years later, another son was executed. And actually, the one that executed a 40th day, about 6 months later, his sister was executed with the son-in-law. So, I mean, within a 3-year period, this mother lost, her only sole surviving child was her 14-year-old who had been arrested at the age of 12 and was in prison. And he he was able to be released at the age of 15 and he was brought out of the country. But so, I mean, that was like, you know, the norm, unfortunately. This mother actually buried her son who was executed herself with her bare hands in the jungle because they wouldn't allow her to bury him in the cemetery. And she was like, she's told me this story before, but it is documented by the by Amnesty International too, because she is one of those who testified to Amnesty International about the 1988 massacre. But her second son, like they had tortured him so much that practically every bone in his body had been broken, and so she always says like his body folded like a suitcase. That's like the thing that she has in her mind. She's like, this body folded like a suitcase. And he, unfortunately, these are the realities of Iran back then. So I guess my parents became active when that was happening. And so that's why I got introduced to the human rights situation in Iran very early on. I think I was about like 4 the first time I met people who were victims of torture
Yeah.
who had been able to escape Iran. They were actually they came to the U.S. to go and testify at the Congress and also at the United Nations in New York. And so in that period, I think it was like probably 2 weeks or so, they were staying at our house. And I got, to meet these people like and see, get to know them, face to face and just hear their stories. I kept on pushing them for them to tell me their stories, of course. And they were like, no, she's a child. She shouldn't be hearing these things, and eventually one of them, because I just wouldn't give in or give up, he ended up telling me his story, but like a rated G version of his story because he knew that I had put, the pieces of the puzzle together. I was like, I've seen posters of you. You're that guy who had his, feet tortured really bad and it's like completely black and whatnot. Because I had seen those images in demonstrations or in books and everything. And he couldn't deny it anymore. So he told me his story and they became my I guess the superheroes in my mind. I
Yeah.
had superheroes, these people who had overcome these circumstances and they were still steadfast and they're still fighting and they are till today. I mean, most of them are currently those people that I met that day. I have connected with them again in later years as an adult, and they are still members of this resistance and continuing to fight. And that is something that I've always cherished. And I'm very grateful to have had the opportunity to know these people and get to learn about their stories. Um, but I guess at that time, I always felt like that's in Iran and we're here. So there was this, I felt lucky not to have to live under those circumstances. And I felt like, even though I was a child, I still felt like responsible to be the voice of, kids my age who didn't have these opportunities that I do, and not to take things that I have for granted. Um, and I guess, when you hit that reality that, oh, kids that are just a few years older than you are being executed, that just, it becomes your reality, and you understand that life isn't as simple as it may seem to others, or what we see around us. But I think everything changed for me in summer of 1988. In summer of 1988, Khomeini had 30,000 political prisoners executed in 5, 6 weeks. It was with the end of the Iran-Iraq War, the ceasefire. With the start of the ceasefire, the mass executions began in Iran. And my father was also killed by the regime at that time. He was actually in the border area of Iran and Iraq and was helping like refugees and things of and people there. And he was killed by the regime too. And they tried to hide it from me for like the first, I guess, month and a half, I'm assuming, because it was still summer when I found out. And he was killed on July 26th. And you know, once I found out, that just like changed everything in my life, because I was daddy's little girl and had like this really close connection with my dad. And it just changed my perspective on life. I understood that, this regime really doesn't see any borders when it comes to its crimes. But I also, uh, I mean, even when I look back, it's still interesting to me that even at the age of 7, I was able to comprehend this and understand it. But um, I remember thinking to myself then that, because I cried for like 3 hours straight when I found out. And then my brother was coming home from kindergarten. He was only 3. And so my mom was like, Zola, if he sees you crying, he's gonna know something's wrong. So just please try to control yourself. And so I was trying to get myself to stop crying. So I was talking to myself, and I remember telling myself, like, what problem is it going to solve? With crying, he's not going to come to life again.
Yeah.
But in my mentality, it was like Khomeini is happy when he sees you crying. So you have to stop crying.
Yeah.
And for me, that was like my form of resistance at the age of 7, was not to give them that satisfaction to see us mourning
Yeah.
or sad. And so that was like what I decided to do. And from that day on, I didn't cry for like a decade. But because even though there were like really tough times that came afterwards, but um, that was like my form of resistance as a child. And so yeah, that was that. My mom actually decided to join the Iranian resistance after my father was killed. And so we ended up going to Iraq. So at that time, we were from the US to Iraq. That's like two different worlds. Um, it was before the Gulf War, so the situation like internationally was very different in Iraq. And then 2 years later, the Gulf War started, and with the first Gulf War, um, it wasn't very safe for children anymore. So my mom came to these crossroads. Like she had to choose, like, what is she going to do? Are we going to come back and live in the US? Or, what are the options? The option was, it was clear that us children staying there was not an option. And fortunately, they didn't do that, because I mean, if you look at the statistics, over 100,000 Iraqi kids died that year in Iraq. But so my mom sent me and my brother back to the US. So we were raised by my aunt, but she decided to stay and continue the fight. And I don't know if you have kids or not, but I
Yeah.
think for any mother, that is like the most difficult decision to have to make,
Sure.
and like it's to make. And especially because, I mean, 2 years before we had just lost our dad, and now being separated from our mom and not knowing when or if we will ever see her again. And at that time I was 9, my brother was 5, and so it was I always I've told her this 100 times, but I take pride in the fact that she made that kind of sacrifice for the freedom of others. That's, I think my parents taught me what's important in life, not through their words, but through their own actions. And I'm grateful for that. Because I know it wasn't a easy decision to make for him.
Yeah. So there's so much trauma and depth that goes into your story that you've had to deal with, just even up to today. So how do you relax? What is it that you can do to kind of disconnect and kind of get away from what's happening so you can recharge and you can get to a healthier place? Is it books? What is it? How do you do that?
Well, I don't think there is a way to like disconnect because like that reality is with you like
Yeah,
24/7.
yeah,
I guess I think one of the things that has always been a um a support system for me is the community that I grew up in,
yeah,
and the fact that there were so many people who showed us so much love and, compassion. And we never felt like there was a void in your life because everyone was so giving and caring. I think that really played a major part. And everyone always told me, like everyone that I grew up again around, they kept on reminding me that, you know, don't ever compare yourself to others and understand that your parents were something special, And, growing up, it was very easy to, when you just make that comparison, be like, why don't we have our parents, or why did my, you know, I never thought that, but there were other kids who did think that, that um, didn't our parents love us to, come and live with us or whatnot. But I think that, that was part of it. But I think for me, that was that network, having that was a big part of it. But also in these years that I've been in the resistance, I have truly, I believe that every day of being a part of this has been a um, a privilege for me. I have gained from all of it on daily basis, even though I have sacrificed everything in my life, personal life for it, but I am the one who is gaining from it every single day. And I think that I have um, had the opportunity to learn so much from it, and especially when it comes to those very rare human values that unfortunately they don't exist practically in society anymore that I have had around me like all this time. And, I draw my inspiration from those who I see, around me and like how they have dedicated their lives or what they're doing and what they have been able to accomplish and how they're able to strive and push forward. And I think that is like the greatest um, aspiration, but also it's like the greatest achievement you could ever possibly want in
yeah,
life. To have a life that's, to have something bigger than yourself to
absolutely.
live for and to fight for. That has always been key. Just just to give you an example, I mean, last month, um, unfortunately, right now there's a wave of political executions in Iran since the ceasefire till now. Practically on daily basis, the regime has been executing political prisoners or protesters. Some of the protesters, when you look at them, they're children as young as like 18, 19 years old, um, who've been executed. They were arrested in January and executed already. But among them, you also see like people who learned about this movement underground. I mean, from the internet or whatever, and connected, and they became members of this movement. And um, these days, we've been hearing their testimonies that they recorded because they knew that this day would come. Or like, for instance, one of them sent his mom a audio notes. It's like 12 minutes or so. And listening to it, I kept on thinking to myself, like, oh, wow, like what a generation,
Yeah,
what inspiration for history. And the thing is that, like, for instance, he talks in his in his message to his mom, he talks about like the 1988 massacre and how when he's walking down these halls of the prison, he keeps on thinking, oh, this is the same halls that they walked
Right.
down, those 30,000 and whatnot. And he wasn't even born back then. And he's continued that fight. And when you see these and you hear their stories and you hear what they had to say and how, I mean, like Zahid, was, he graduated at the top of his class. He was an engineer. He was truly like an elite student, by on all standards. But, he goes and he knows that, his execution can either turn to something that spreads fear in society, or he could turn it as a source of inspiration for people.
Yeah.
And that's what, at the age of 32,
Yeah.
and, it's seeing these people, I guess it puts a different perspective on like everything that you've been through.
Yeah.
And as I said, I always consider myself, I've never seen myself as like the victim. I've always seen myself as someone who's very lucky to have these, you know, um, this understanding and have these opportunities to actually be able to strive for it and do something about it.
Speaking of, if anybody wants to get involved with the resistance, they want to support what you're doing and get involved, how can they do that?
Well, for those who are in the US, I'm assuming like most people who are watching or tuning in are from the US,
Yeah.
you can reach out to Organization of Iranian American Communities. It's oiac.org. They have chapters in over 40 states. So
Okay.
you're probably covered there. They just held a rally on Saturday in Upper Senate Park, which thousands of people actually attended. Um, they do a lot of work locally, but also with their lawmakers and also like protests and things of that nature. So if you reach out to them, they would be more than happy to have your support. For those who are outside of the US, you can reach out to iranfreedom.org, and they will put you in contact with local chapters across Canada, Australia, Europe, wherever you are. Right now, the diaspora is actually working on a annual, like a huge gathering, international gathering, which was going to be held on June 20th in Paris, that they're expecting about 100,000 people
Oh,
to be attending. It is to mark the anniversary of the 1981 June 20th protest,
gotcha.
because there's so many parallels today to that, to back then, but it's also against the executions and to support the people of Iran. So, if anyone happens to be in Europe at that time, you're more than welcome to join. But it will also be broadcast live on social media platforms, so you could tune in and watch and show your support and solidarity, even with the post. Yeah, so
Excellent. I will put all these links in the show notes. Again, thank you so much for coming back to the show. The bravery, the integrity, what you're doing is wonderful, and I can't wait to get the word out. So thank you again, and best of luck with everything. I appreciate it.
thank you very much. I greatly appreciate the opportunity.
You
But
bet.
because of the nature of the Iranian regime, they are going to try to drag out reaching a concession on this. You have to remember that even the 8-year Iran-Iraq war, it's still a ceasefire. They've never reached a
Wow.
peace agreement.
Okay.
Um, and because this regime, as I mentioned at the beginning, they strive on crisis,
Yeah.
because in this crisis, they're able to play both the victim card and the hero card for
Gotcha.
some. They're able to, like with the smoke screen, what they're doing right now is, like, for instance, it is legitimizing their extreme suppression. Right now, there's martial law all over Iran. People are being executed, as I mentioned, every single day, and there's an international silence on it, and that is what's devastating.
Wow.
Usually, when they're political executions, and governments show some kind of a reaction, even if it's a statement. But this time around, like for instance, I remember last year in July, two political prisoners were executed. Most countries, their foreign ministries, they gave a statement, or the State Department and whatnot. This time around, it's been every single day there has been a political execution, and there has been complete silence. Only the United Nations has given statements,
Yeah.
and that is because everyone is afraid of, you know, its effect on the negotiations. And so
Yeah.
it's giving this green light to the regime that, oh, during this time you could execute with open hands and no one's going to do anything. And this is exactly what happened in 1988. It was right at the ceasefire. Everyone was so you know, it was such a fragile state that everyone turned a blind eye. And before anyone knew, 30,000 were executed and no one dared to speak. And so we really need to get this stopped. We need to bring attention to it today.
Absolutely. Well, we will get the word out. So thank you again so much for your story, for talking about this. There's so much that I had no idea about. So again, thank you for your work. Thank you for putting the word out there. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure to be with you.
Great to be here. Thank you.